So I've been touring around Europe for the last week and I've really been struck by the fear that exists about the concentration of power in the largest tech companies. The number of times I've heard across the political spectrum, people who usually defend business talking about totalitarianism and the worries they have about all of our lives being controlled by these few platforms has really shocked me. And it helps me understand why there's such a large movement these days to try to think of ways to further decentralize power. Tim Berners-Lee, inventor of the World Wide Web, has been really pushing a new protocol in terms of how we can have technology that allows us to control our data more. Blockchain movement, as Victoria mentioned, is all built around this notion of decentralizing power. And yet, we've tried decentralizing power so many times. Private property and modern liberalism were supposed to be about decentralizing power. Democracy was supposed to decentralize power. The World Wide Web was supposed to decentralize power. And every time, we've seen these reconcentrations of power. I have this book with Eric Posner that came out a few months ago, and what it tries to do is use a science, an economic field called mechanism design, to actually think through what it might look like if we were to build rules into the system that could sustainably decentralize power by actually thinking through the social and economic incentive dynamics created by those systems. And I can't tell you about all of that in 15 minutes, but I want to give you a vision of how it might change how we think a little bit about politics and break apart some of our existing categories. So I'd like you to come with me on a journey of imagination, suspend your disbelief for a moment as you would in science fiction, and meet a city called Marketopia. So Marketopia is defined by the fact that all the significant private property, the land and the houses, the factories and the intellectual property, the airplanes and trucks, are continually up for auction to the highest bidder. And this highest bidder is allowed to possess those assets as long as she satisfies two conditions. First, she makes a monthly payment of that highest bid into a central pool that will be shared by all. And second, she stands ready to surrender that asset to anyone who comes along and outbids her for control of it. And while this principle isn't applied to things like pets or family heirlooms, personal property, it does apply to things that you would usually consider to be collective decisions. Things like whether Marketopia, which has been for many years a member of the market union, will decide to exit. Where the parks are located, who governs Marketopia, what routes the buses run along. Except here, the principle is a little bit different. Rather than the single highest bidder determining what happens, instead, every citizen will submit bids on all the alternatives. We'll add these up, and whichever alternative has the greatest bid will be selected. And the revenue that's raised in this way will be continually returned to the citizens of Marketopia in the form of public goods that can be provided with those resources, or what we call social dividend. You might call it universal basic income, much as the oil revenue in Norway and in Alaska is returned to the citizens. Now, your first reaction when you hear about Marketopia is that this is probably the most extreme form of a free market you can possibly imagine, something that even Adam Smith couldn't have dreamt up in a fever dream. Because we think of ourselves as living in a free market society. We think UK, Margaret Thatcher, free markets, right? And yet most assets in this country are not available for some process of competitive bidding. If you wanted to repurpose the Tate Modern for some really creative new startup accelerator, it's not like there's just some going price. You'd have to enter into a long, drawn-out process of negotiation with the current owners. They'd figure out that you had something creative to do with it. They'd probably charge you way more than they'd be willing to accept. And it would drag on for years, probably fall apart. Most things are not like stock markets or like going to Sainsbury's. They're usually, for large assets, very complicated business negotiations. In Marketopia, on the other hand, everything is turned into a liquid asset. Everything is continually competitively bid. Everything is constantly returned to its best social use. Now, that might sound provocative. Maybe we don't quite live in as free market as we think, but it probably doesn't sound appealing, right? In a world where everything's constantly being bid for, aren't the wealthy going to dominate everyone else? Aren't they going to be able to buy up all the assets and tyrannize over everyone? Well, you have to ask yourself, what do you mean by wealthy? Wealthy is the adjective form of wealth. And what is wealth, after all, but buildings and land and IP and airplanes? And in those things, no one owns them in Marketopia. All of their value is continually returned in equal parts to every citizen. And every citizen has an absolute right to use those assets that they receive to contest for control over these things. In this sense, Marketopia is a far more thoroughgoing implementation of the vision of common ownership advocated by this 200-year-old guy than are any of the communist systems that he actually managed to implement in practice, which inevitably degenerated into the tyranny of a small bureaucratic elite that was all the more iron than the capitalist oppressors that they claimed to be replacing. So that sounds like a paradox. How can something simultaneously be the most extreme form of socialism and the most extreme form of the free market? I thought our politics were all structured around the notion that those are opposites to each other. Wasn't that what Margaret Thatcher fought for against the Labour governments? And yet, the notion that you can not only have free markets and socialism at the same time, but that you can't have a truly free market without socialism, and that you can't have true common ownership without the decentralization that markets facilitate, was not only a possibility, but a dogma in the field of political economy that gave birth to sociology, political science, and economics in the late 19th century. The people who founded what's called the Marginal Revolution, which is the basis of any of the economics that any of you have studied, Leon Walras and William Stanley Jevons, these folks believed you couldn't possibly have free markets and competition without common ownership. And that idea was most closely associated with the work of this gentleman here. Now, how many people recognize the guy on the right when I put him up on the screen? Raise your hands. About half the audience. How about the guy on the left? Now, can anyone tell me who this is? Ah, well, you already, oh, come on, that's not fair. He's already seen the presentation. Has anyone, raise your hand if you knew that this was Henry George when I put him up. I only got one person in the whole audience, and he was a cheater. So Henry George outsold those other two guys by a factor of 3. He was the best-selling author in the English language, other than the Bible, for 30 years. He was the primary political inspiration for the careers of two of your greatest prime ministers, Winston Churchill, who cut his teeth giving fiery Georgist speeches in the, around the turn of the 20th century, and David Lloyd George, who passed the People's Budget, which was all based on George's principles. And yet, his ideas are largely unknown to the public. But they didn't completely disappear. They continued to develop within the field of economics through the work of a man named William Vickery into a field that's come to be called mechanism design. And Vickery won the Nobel Prize for that work. In fact, several other Nobel Prizes have been given out for that work. But they haven't been used for the socially transformative vision for which Vickery and George designed them. Instead, they're used by Facebook and Google to price their ads. And Vickery was very disappointed by this. When he won the Nobel Prize in 1995, he thought finally the time had come when he would have a public stage to show people how that the real flaws of capitalism could be addressed. And then he died 2 days later. And the goal of this book is to take those ideas that have been developing on the cutting edge of economics for 40 years, and to turn them into a vision for saving our societies from the growing inequality, the falling productivity, and the political conflict that we face. And we do that through 5 proposals. The first is the common ownership self-assessed tax, under which every corporation and wealthy individual with significant assets would self-assess the value of those assets, pay a tax on that self-assessed value, but have to stand ready to sell the assets at the price that they self-assessed. This would, according to our estimates, increase the value of capital in the private economy by actually a factor of 3, which would correspond to a 40% growth in GDP, because it will allow for far more dynamic reallocation of assets. The spectrum that's currently clogged up with all the over-the-air television and radio broadcasters would be reallocated to new 5G, LTE technologies. Land could be reallocated to new developments, and cities could be much more dynamic. But you might think this is going to threaten people's stability. In fact, this would raise enough revenue to not only eliminate all other capital taxes and pay off most of the national debt, but also pay a £20,000 a year social dividend to every family of 4 in the United Kingdom, allowing them to maintain a wide range of assets, even if they price them well above the market. Second, we propose a new voting system, which rather than having minorities defend themselves against the tyranny of majorities by relying on judges and bureaucrats and party bureaucracies that make compromises, instead would allow every citizen to weigh in on the issues and candidates for and against that are most important to them. Every citizen would receive an equal budget of voice credits that they could allocate across these different issues and candidates. But so that people aren't just extremists and put everything on one issue or one candidate, the cost of expressing that would grow quadratically, so that the first vote would cost 1 credit, the second an additional 3, the third an additional 5. So everyone would have an incentive to buy votes in proportion to how important the issues are to them, achieving the greatest good for the greatest number. Third, we propose a new system of migration, where rather than all the benefits of migration going to wealthy employers or to the migrants themselves, as they do in Canada, every citizen would have a right to sponsor migrants and take some responsibility for their adjustment and so forth, in exchange for the migrant being allowed, through a market process, to make a payment to the sponsor for doing that. This would align the interests of the working class people who are most worried about migration to the process of migration, allowing for far greater levels of migration in wealthy countries and therefore much greater global equality. Fourth, we argue that antitrust is absolutely critical to market economies. You can't have a market economy without competition any more than you can have democracy in a one-party state. And yet, we argue that antitrust hasn't really been tried. You call it competition policy here. Has not really been tried. What do we mean? Most of the market power that exists in wealthy countries is completely ignored by antitrust enforcement. There are a few investment firms, Vanguard, State Street, BlackRock. These own about a quarter of the corporate economy, and they're 4 of the 5 largest investors in almost every large firm. And so they have no interest in seeing these companies compete for consumers, for workers, or in the political process, allowing them to dominate politics. And there are simple fixes to this that antitrust has completely ignored, even though it's the most iron monopoly that has ever existed, coordinating all of capital. Second, anyone who's ever worked a job knows that companies have much more power over the people they employ than the people who buy products from them. And yet, competition policy completely ignores the power of companies over their workers. And this, again, can be fixed in a simple way. Finally, and perhaps most relevant to this audience, the work that we do every day online, checking our Twitter feed, contributing, and so forth, creates data that trains the artificial intelligence systems that everyone is telling us is going to throw us out of a job. And yet, that's not replacing humans with machines. It's replacing paid labor with unpaid labor. The large tech platforms are taking all the work we're doing, they're making these incredible products out of them, and they're not even telling us that we're the ones who are creating all the value. We argue that we need to form data labor unions to create power to bargain for a fair share of the value that's created in this economy. So these are all very radical ideas. They're not things we'd advocate implementing overnight. And there are small incremental ways in which we can start to do all of these things. And we're starting to do them with entrepreneurs and with governments and so forth. But we portray this as a broader ideology because we think the world desperately needs it. Our politics are increasingly dominated by those who want to concentrate power even further, by the Steve Bannons of the world, by the Jeremy Corbyns of the world. We instead need to find ways to embrace openness, to embrace diversity, to embrace liberal, market-driven societies, and to use these to solve our biggest problems. And so, coming out of this book, there's been a huge amount of interest from all sorts of social forces, from The Economist magazine, which adopted a lot of the ideas in their recent manifesto, to the Ethereum community, where this has become central to the whole project that they're engaged in. And to coordinate all these activities, we've created this organization, Radical Exchange, that is bringing together artists, activists, entrepreneurs, researchers from all different areas to try to work on building and spreading ideas about how we can use market mechanisms to create a radically more cooperative and equal world. Thank you.